Dr. Stephanie Heitkemper, welcome to the Art and Science of EMDR, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Rodam. Hi, everyone. I can't see your faces, but I'm so glad you're here. I have a private practice in the Denver metro area, but today I am joining you from cloudy and gloomy Cape Cod. And I just wanted to let you all know that after today's presentation, I'll PDF my slide deck, and then you can have it. So please don't feel like you have to take a ton of notes. However, the slides intentionally are pretty robust, so that you have this as a tool to go back to. It may be a little helpful just to know a little bit more about me. So one of the things that I'm passionate about is EMDR, but really truly grief. And my passion started from working with children, in particular bereaved children. And that is actually what I've done my entire career. So we are headed into close to year 20 and specifically working with bereaved children in the United States. So outside of private practice, I'm also the clinical director for Camp HAL in New York City. And I volunteer for a plethora of different organizations and provide professional and nonprofit consulting to support bereavement centers. So at the end, we'll leave some time for some Q&A.
Yeah, so I want to ask, what was the topic of your PhD?
So my dissertation looked at, do peer-based grief support programs address the risk factors associated with childhood bereavement? So one of the things that I really wanted to pull back layers on in research was, what are we looking for when we're supporting bereaved children? What could children be at risk for developing if their grief is left untouched and untalked about? And so we know things like depression and anxiety, but we also know that they can have a higher ACE score, right? And that they may have different disparities, that their childhood experience scale ratings can go up. And so one of the things that I wanted to look at is, what's the benefit of being able to potentially do individual therapy, but what's the true benefit of when you come to a peer-based center? So a peer-based center is something that is clinically or non-clinically led. There's kind of two ways that this can be done in the US. And then we also have camps and after-school programs. Some groups are open-ending, meaning that families can come for as long as they feel necessary for their hearts, and some are closed. And so what we showed is that there's limited research out there. The field of childhood bereavement is not really truly a field, but really a passion area, and it hasn't been around very long. So we're looking at sub 50 years, but we know that it's instrumental in changing the trajectory of how kids process their grief and adjust as adults. So we're going to cover 5 main areas: some psychoeducation on grief, grief models, the health disparity in bereavement, assessments, and then ways to use EMDR for grief. I think it's important that we go over psychoeducation and grief models, as well as health disparity and bereavement information to help you best support your client. Once you know that information, assessments just help you gain more information and more insight, kind of help you pick that path with your client on how to support their grief. I don't know if you all are readers or if you're in Rodam's book club, but I love this quote from A Grief Observed. C.S. Lewis said, "No one ever told me that grief felt so like fear. I'm not afraid, but the sensation is like being afraid. The same fluttering in the stomach, the same relentlessness, the same yawning, and I keep swallowing." I must say, I think that C.S. Lewis was wiser than his time in so many ways. But this really talks about grief, and it's one that I sit with and use in almost every presentation, because grief is stored in a region of our brain that has no verbal access. And so for many, it does feel like that sensation of being afraid, but not being afraid, right? That same fluttering. So EMDR can truly support grief and that journey towards healing. When we get into the psychoeducation, we're going to cover the following things: grief versus trauma, different types of grief, suicide language, and grief versus mourning. Grief is a biopsychosocial symptomology that includes anxiety, depression, sleep disturbance, educational impairments, separation anxiety, external experiences, and it can really change the idea of attachment, right? And in grief, there's this reconstruction of attachment and meaning over time. And I think it's important when we think about clients as they enter into our offices and they're looking to use EMDR to support their grief, we need to peel back the layers. What are they looking for? Is it this anxiety, right? Was there an underlying pre-existing depression, right? Ultimately, also teasing out that depression and sadness are two different things, right? What is their current sleep disturbance like? What was it like prior? So it's really about befriending the grief before we get into EMDR. So there's no reward for speed. Dr. Wolfelt, who is in Fort Collins, runs the Center of Loss and Life Transition. And he says to mourn is to be an active participant of our grief journeys. We all grieve when someone we love dies. But if we are to heal, we must also mourn. Mourning, according to Dr. Wolfelt, is that public showing of our grief. It's what we do on the outside, where grief is internal. And sometimes this can be confusing in therapy. We may see that families have done funerals and that they've had celebrations of life. They've done, memorial walks and all of these things to honor and mourn the person who died. But we may have a client who internally is struggling. So I love to hold this in mind, right? What we do on the inside versus what we do on the outside can be two different things. When it comes time to trauma, this is important. This summer, I had the opportunity to attend Dr. Mary Frances O'Connor's The Grieving Brain. And then I highly recommend that you all read her book. It came out this year, but she really talked about grief and trauma. And one of the takeaways from that conference was that we have to befriend the grief before we can get into the trauma. Trauma can have some of the same effects that grief does, but not all grief is traumatic, right? It's up to us to ask our clients, not to make a judgment for them, to ask about their experience. Also, grief can be traumatic for one family member, but not for another. This is something that I see often in working with younger children. So remembering that trauma is an individual experience. When we're going to support grief in our offices and our practices, language matters. So grief is a universal experience. However, expression is unique, right? Everybody has the opportunity to express themselves the way they'd like to express themselves. So as we support our clients, we must remember to use appropriate language, such as died by suicide versus committed suicide. This changed in 1999 with the Compassionate Friends movement, and it's really important. It's not about correcting our clients, but it's about using the appropriate language so that they can shift their language as well. We also say things like died from homicide, died of an accidental overdose, or died of COVID-19 or from COVID-19. This is important because those can be stigmatized losses. Our willingness to sit in the discomfort and use the proper language can really help our clients. I also think about language and the way that grief is expressed being so unique in so many different ways. This can be in nonverbal, right? How are they going about their lives? What are they saying or not saying? It can be the words they choose. Somebody once said to me, I love the early days of grief, not that I'd want to be in them, but that person thought she got a pay raise, she got stuff done, she didn't take no for an answer. She's like, I kind of miss that person, because then it went away. It could be physical, right? It could be that your client is now moving a lot more or becoming sedentary. It also may be what their body is doing. Perhaps there's a change in their sleep patterns, their hair, right? Just their body temperature. So let's think about what that story looks like. What are those languages of grief? Shame dies when stories are told in safe spaces. That's my hope when I get ready to use EMDR with a client who has experienced grief. I want them to be able to find healing for those parts of their story that they may not feel safe or like they can share with anybody else. A good example of this is that sometimes after a long struggle, people may find relief when the person in their family dies. Perhaps it's that they're no longer caretaking, they're no longer exhausted, or they're no longer worried. Out in the public, to be able to say, I feel relief, can feel really stigmatizing and shameful. But in therapy, when you're working around that narrative with EMDR, it can feel hopeful. This is just comparing those two ideas between grief and trauma again. Types of grief. You have probably caught on that there are lots of different types of grief. So it's not a one size fits all. When a client comes into your office to talk about grief, it's really about looking at those layers. Pauline Voss talked about ambiguous grief. Ambiguous grief is the difference between a physical absence, but still mentally being there, or a psychological absence, but with a physical presence. When I think about that last one, I may think about dementia, right? That somebody in our lives, our life is still there. However, psychologically, they may not be there. That is something to use as a potential EMDR target. What is that like for that person, that caregiver, that child, that sibling? Disenfranchised grief examples, so this is just a short list, may include infertility, death of a pet, divorce, loss of community, estrangement, right? Moving, job change. This is important. That's grief, right? They're missing them. There's a lot of protest and despair in this change narrative that may or may not be in their control. Complicated grief, is an intense grief after the death of someone who's died, right? It feels like this long process. Our grief reactions in mourning may change, and sometimes people may find that it becomes unhealthy. When you see a client who is struggling with complex grief, it's important to look at all parts of their story. It's also important that as clinicians, we don't rush to diagnose prolonged grief disorder, but rather we come alongside them and we figure out more and look at their support system and what they may need. And then if that is the right assessment and thought, that comes after a year for adults and after 6 months for children. But I really encourage you all to understand what's going on. What is this looking like? Why is it considered abnormal? Those coming to our office who may experience traumatic grief could be from a sudden unexpected loss, such as suicide or homicide, or a stigmatized grief. Stigmatized grief includes, as mentioned before, and COVID and accidental overdose, suicide, and homicide. So those are just some different ways that grief may come into our offices. Some quick grief models to hold in mind as you prepare to work with your client. My favorite is the dual process grief model by Strobe and Charette from 1999. And why this is important is that these lines in between loss-oriented and restoration, it's kind of like this going back and forth. It's when our client says, oh, sometimes I can't do this and sometimes I can. And am I going crazy because this morning I didn't think about the person who died and I tried something new? It's that back and forth. It's holding both and. Both and is probably my most commonly used phrase in my office when it comes time to grief, right? We're holding both parts of us, the part before the person died and the part after. This can go on for years, right? This is that learning style of grief, that learning trajectory. That's what Mary Frances O'Connor referred to as grieving the learning style. For children, a common grief model includes the multidimensional grief theory. And that what I love about this is that we're looking at that adaptive and maladaptive, which I think really speaks to EMDR, right? I see Rodham nodding his head. It's like, yes, they used our language. But it's important because this also helps us look at the full context. And while this is geared toward children, I really do think that we can even use this for adults, right? Or what was triggered from their past narrative or their younger narrative. This also may come back up when we look at what was their childhood like? What was their story like? I view bereavement as a health disparity, and I think it's important that we talk about this epidemic. Guilt is perhaps the most painful companion to death, said Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and I think that EMDR can support the guilt that comes into our office and the pain attached to the death, and that it's okay if some of our clients have no guilt and may not have that same complex pain. It's not a one-size-fits-all. I know as practitioners, you all are very, very familiar with the ACE scale, but I think an image as we think about grief is always really important. It's important too, because we think about other changes that come when somebody who is instrumental in our life dies. And so I put this image out there to kind of flag our brains and remind us of other things that may be going on, other parts of the story that EMDR may be beneficial for. In 2021, 1,192 kids were bereaved each day. And this statistic comes from the work of Judy's House and NACG and New York Life Foundation, which are instrumental in providing childhood bereavement research. In the nation right now, 1 in 12 children will experience the death of a parent or sibling before 18. It comes with lots of different risk factors. And so I think that it's important that we think about EMDR and how it can support not only the children, but their families. Often I see widows and widowers who are saying things like, I'm a terrible parent. I'm not doing enough. I can't be there. And we know the detriment that that negative cognition has in them being present for their children. So listen to the full story. Um, I wanted to give you all some hyperlinks in this presentation back to resources in particular to support children. That's something that's very important to me. So leading research comes from Judy's House out of Denver, the National Alliance for Children's Grief, the New York Life Foundation, eLuna, which is the parent company for Camp Aaron and for Mariposa. So Camp Aaron supports children who have been impacted by the death of somebody, and Mariposa for addiction, and then the Dougie Center. Some things to think about. After somebody in our family dies, we may see disrupted sleep and high stress. The high stress is actually linked to a cortisol level change, right? There's lots of things that go on, but we also know that public health risk and changes are different depending on your cultural awareness and orientation in your community. And so it's important to ask questions, right? To be there in those moments. I couldn't help but think in my work with those from Robb Elementary and Uvalde about the story of the teacher who died in the school shooting, and her husband died within 24 hours later. I don't know if any of you all remember this. It was part of the headline. And it really stuck out to me that following the death of somebody who's close to you, you are 21 times more likely to experience a heart attack, 8 times higher the following week, and 4 times higher following the first month. And so I see this because there are so many things changing inside the body and the brain that it's our job and responsibility as therapists to really come alongside and be mindful of that. I also give you this information so that you're looking at the big picture before beginning EMDR to really make sure that it's safe and your client is in a place where they can receive the support. It's important in all of our care, whether it's grief and EMDR or just EMDR in general, that we're being culturally conscious. We're acknowledging, we're asking, we're accepting, we're aligning, and we're apologizing. I'm not perfect, and I don't know that any of you are either, but it's always good to be curious. Dr. William Steele taught me years ago in my trauma work to use my pointer finger and really to be curious and to acknowledge and accept and learn. And I think when we sit back and we can feel comfortable with that discomfort, it's important. We get to learn more and we get to see the bigger picture and really hear what our clients' needs are. So assessments, we can use the MID, the PG-13R, the YSL, and the self-compassion scale. I hope that you all are familiar with the MID and that you all take extra training when you use it, but this can be incredibly valuable as you set a client up for EMDR. Holly Prigerson developed the PG-13 revised, and so this is for the prolonged grief disorder. The scale runs from 10 to 55. It's a great tool to see where your clients are, just to understand their grief and where some of their triggers may be or some of their targets. You can download it for free on the internet. And Mary Frances O'Connor did the Yearning in Situations of Loss scale, the YSL. And this 21 question scale, again, is free on the internet. It gives you an idea of where your client is. The YSL has lots of different versions, including breakup, which is disenfranchised grief. The assessment of self-compassion. What I find to be really helpful about the self-compassion scale is that this is going to show us if our client is utilizing adaptive coping skills or maladaptive coping skills. What does their resiliency look like? What's their internal messaging? What do they need? What are they potentially lacking? Especially as we think about complicated grief, using the self-compassion scale is valuable to see where your client is. All right. So the nuts and bolts of all the psychoeducation are ways that we can use EMDR. So we can use recent protocol, we can look at attachment themes, we can even look to support complex PTSD. We can look to see if our clients may be stuck in part of a dual process model or the multi-dimensional part of grief theory or chronic loneliness. Healing is not the absence of pain. Healing for me is being able to bear the unbearable, being able to lift my head off the pillow in the morning and lean into life silhouetted in sorrow. And even in the midst of great loss, being able to even greater love. I think that this is important. There's a misnomer out in our community that says EMDR takes away the grief and the pain. And the truth is that it doesn't. That will never go away. And as a clinician, I challenge you to authentically talk about that with your clients. What are they looking to resolve in their pain? To know that using EMDR will never bring the person back from the dead, but that it may change that discomfort in their body, or that ability to say their name, or that ability to be a present parent. These are all different ways that you can use it, as mentioned. So we have recent protocol and the standard protocol. I think it's important to really hear the part of the story where your client is being activated and really sit with them in those moments. Most often in grief, I'm using the recent protocol for a traumatic loss. However, there's no reward for speed, and I'm really trying to sit there and be with my client in those beginning days. I believe that we can use EMDR in two ways. So if we think about our hands, we have our left hand and our right hand. If we made a fist with our left hand, I think about this being our grief. If I think about my right hand kind of coming over top, I think about this potentially being the trauma. And what I'm using EMDR to do is to lift the trauma, right? Ultimately, hopefully to reduce the internal unrest from the trauma and messaging attached to it, so that we can befriend and companion the grief, so that I can hear their story, so that I can use resource development to strengthen attachment and those continued bonds. In attachment, I think about past attachment ruptures are a great thing to use EMDR for. What was that like? What may be haunting them? So often people have guilt that they had a fight 6 months before, and maybe they said something that wasn't kind. Struggles with their own regulation, right? When somebody dies, that changes the attachment hierarchy, and that person may be your regulator. What's going on in the dual process? What's the mixed messaging about being a present parent to your surviving kids and yet yearning for your deceased child, going back and forth? Oh, I think I put in graphics. So this one is talking about the attachment hierarchy. Making them fly in. So when somebody dies, it may remove one of those circles. And how do we move around that? What does our story look like? How are we going to handle this? I also think about using EMDR with sand play. On my website is a complimentary sandbox that Meredith Hammond and I both have, but really helping understand the story. What does it look like? To being able to talk about it and not be death avoidant. And just a general plug that I'm around town and on the internet to help you navigate your complicated cases and really be able to befriend grief and not be so scared about it. So that is what I have for you all.
Great, thank you.
I hope that was like the speed edition. I felt like it went by so fast.
Yeah. Obviously, we're just introducing an idea, and I really like what you said about EMDR. Takes away the pain of the trauma, but not the grief. Because I think it's a normal thing to experience grief, and I think we're trying to target the grief to take away normal, organic feelings and emotions. We're not doing the best service for our clients.
I 100% agree with you, Rodam. So I think that often what I see in consultation is people will say, I targeted the grief, but I don't think that they know what they really want to target, right? That's the difference. Is it the yearning that you can't turn off and you can't function? And what is that saying about you? Like, what do you hope to gain, or what have you lost, versus just the sadness, right? And it's okay to be sad when somebody dies. In fact, it's part of your expression on the grief on the inside and the mourning on the outside. I think really what I would love to see people do with EMDR is spend some time resourcing. Even if in the beginning, when you're doing your history and preparation, if you're not able to offer it to the person, I think about my bereaved moms and dads, right? They're not ready for that, but I'm jotting down notes, right? They loved her in her purple dress, and they were so proud of her when she scored her first goal. And when he, conquered a big fear or did his own work. I think about all those moments, and often I find myself keeping them at the bottom of the note. In my simple practice, I have a little box that says EMDR considerations and information that may be helpful in the future, and I use that section all the time. But then I really add back to that, and I also use that later when looking at pictures with those who have experienced the death of somebody in their life, like his smile or the time he supported you to take a really big risk. It can be so helpful to have that continued bond, right? It fits into Warden's 4 tasks of grief, and or mourning rather, and just how to navigate that together. But I think the other thing I'd love to stress in this conversation tonight is that it's not the big picture, right? We're looking at small pieces of the picture, and that's important because I think when we think about the big picture, it just becomes super overwhelming.
Mm. Yeah. Okay, so for the people who watch this not live, they watch it later on YouTube or on the Art and Science of EMDR website, this is the part that we are having our community members join. We are ending the recording, but we are having our community members join and ask Stephanie questions. It's our Q&A part. So Dr. Stephanie Heitkemper, thank you so much for joining us again.
Thank you so much for having me. And I hope that this is just an entry point to being able to support those that are grieving. And always remember that there's truly no reward for speed, but we have to acknowledge the grief and then lift the trauma potentially with the EMDR and go back to the grief.
Okay, great. So I think we're